Well, good morning. It is good to be with you. Special thanks to Dr. Lino and the Land Center for the invitation. I'm grateful. And I also want to extend my thanks specifically to Dr. Lino and Dr. Lofton, who have brought me into this conversation of what it means to have a theology of work. It's an interdisciplinary topic that I've learned much from their conversations and the research they've pointed me to. It is worth noting that anything I say is necessarily their fault. So if you don't like what I say, take it up with them. But nevertheless, with the time that we have, I'm going to attempt to describe a theology of work in the present, in the book of Ruth. Now, I do so as somewhat of an Old Testament theologian. And I say that because I do not seek to systematize the material of the Old and New Testaments, but merely seek to describe an important, albeit understudied, theme in the book of Ruth. I describe this theme, and at times I will attempt to draw out some implications for contemporary men and women of faith. Within the discipline of OT theology, for those that care about such things, my approach is topical, which approaches a major idea regardless of the ability to unify the Old Testament. This is seen by Walt Zimmerly a generation ago. And in the latter part of my presentation, I will employ a multiplex canonical approach similar to Gerhard Hassel to elucidate my topic. For today's presentation, I want to simply state that a theology of work is a theological theme present in the text of Ruth that is instructive, not only to understand the narrative, but part and parcel of what the narrative is communicating. That is to say, work may not be the point of Ruth, but is certainly not beside the point. And as Dr. Lino mentioned, however briefly, I do come from the great state of Mississippi, North Mississippi, in fact, and grew up in an agricultural area. So when I've personally been introduced to the topic of work, the conversation of theology of work, I come at it with much appreciation for my father and grandfather, who have worked many hours, many years, supporting our family in the agricultural world. So I'm very grateful to talk about the topic in some way. But I want to begin situating ourselves with this topic. The larger conversation of a theology of work, as well as my presentation, has two primary addressees, and I think both are here today. Christians who are charged with leading congregations, especially in terms of teaching, and Christians whose primary activity and income come outside the local church. It is my hope that we can realize the depth of what Scripture discusses and move beyond what I personally consider the irritating and anemic application of many sermons, which is to go home and read your Bible. Now, I want to be quite clear here. I am a biblical studies professor, and I do want every man and woman of faith to go home and read their Bible. I just think the Bible itself gets at a whole lot more than a self-perpetuating exercise. There's more to it than that. In contrast, the study of an Old Testament theology of work should lead to a richer understanding of how the Bible connects to what occupies most time of most people's lives, which is work. We begin our study with the opening of Ruth. And here I'm going to assume that you know some details of the book of Ruth. Hopefully I will lead you along well enough that you recall the things that you need to recall, but I'm assuming at least that you've read it once or twice. As we open up the book of Ruth, we see we're in the time of Judges, a demoralizing downward spiral of leadership. A famine occurs in Judah. Because of the famine, family from Bethlehem of Judah make their way to Moab. The husband and father, Elimelech, soon dies, leaving his wife Naomi and his two sons, Kilion and Malchon, in a foreign land. The sons take Moabite wives, Ruth and Orpah. During the decade or so in Moab, the sons die, leaving Naomi and her two Moabite daughters-in-law alone. Sometime later, Naomi, as well as Ruth and Orpah, begin to travel to Judah because Naomi heard that the Lord had visited his people, Israel, giving them food. Such news is welcome to the reader because now the conflict of famine and foreigners are solved. Naomi can return to her homeland, and the 2 daughters-in-law can go back to Moab. Everything seems squared away. Naomi kisses the girls. They weep. Naomi directs the girls to Moab. With some debate, Orpah heeds the words of her mother-in-law and goes back to Moab. Ruth, however, clings to Naomi, showing commitment to her. Eventually, Naomi realizes that Ruth's dedication is unwavering and lets her travel back to Judah with her. Naomi returns to Judah and rebrands herself, as many of you recall, as a bitter woman. Bitterness not due to happenstance, but specifically by the hand of God. Famine has worn the soles of Naomi's sandals, forcing her to travel to a foreign land. And within a new, strange land, Naomi knew only heartache and an unshakable daughter-in-law. Naomi characterizes her state as rekam, that is emptiness. And by the way, for some of my Hebrew students that are here, I'm going to attempt to keep them on their toes by referencing a few Hebrew words. We leave chapter 1 of Ruth back in the land of Judah with an older and distraught Naomi, her Moabite daughter-in-law who is loyal, if nothing else. We're left asking questions like, how will these 2 characters, Ruth in particular, reverse the emptiness of Naomi? How will their arrival to Judah at the beginning of the harvest have anything to do with the solution? Chapter 2 begins by informing the reader that the deceased Elimelech had a living relative whose name was Boaz. Ruth, however, is not privy to the information. The narrative picks up speed when Ruth the Moabite requests that she be allowed to glean in the field. At this point, an unknown field belonging to an unknown person. The criterion for gleaning, according to Ruth, is that she find favor in the eyes of one who owns the field. Now, it's here that I like to pause and let some of the details of this narrative sink in. Ruth, a foreigner, is in the land of her distraught mother-in-law. The 2 are widows. How will they survive? While there are certain provisions for widows in the ancient Near East, will the people of Bethlehem uphold these provisions? Widowhood in the ancient Near East could lead to slavery, prostitution, or destitution. Will this be the case for Ruth and Naomi? The entire reason for Naomi having to leave Judah is gone. There's now fertile crops. How will the 2 women acquire these crops? Without any discussion from the narrative simply dives into how Ruth demonstrates her commitment to Naomi. She will work. Let me reiterate. A foreign widow has arrived in Judah, and the first thing she says in the presentation of the narrative is, "Let me work." Let us not romanticize the point or diminish it as if it were insignificant to what the narrative is doing. Ruth gives no hint of wanting this work to be her passion. We see no discussion of how this gleaning will fulfill her as a person. Furthermore, there is no inkling of how she wants to use this work as a stepping stone to reach more prominence of position or income. Nothing of the sort. Our typical Americanisms are lost on this narrative. How should the stark and bold move of Ruth be heard today, particularly by millennials? Now, I'll draw my attention to millennials a lot in this presentation, primarily because they make up a majority of my students, and I find them to be an exciting and interesting bunch of people. So, regarding working millennials, Gallup poll has recently given some helpful notes on how organizations should handle these people and what they should know. Number 1, millennials don't just work for a paycheck, they work for purpose. Number 2, millennials are not pursuing job satisfaction, they are pursuing development. Number 3, millennials don't want bosses, they want coaches. Society at large, and no exaggeration, is wrestling with how to hire and keep millennials. Even for some of the more disciplined millennials, flourishing at work seems to be a struggle. Take Timothy, for example. I met Timothy on a flight to Boston about 2 weeks ago. Beyond being a delightful and kind young man, Timothy is also irritatingly accomplished. At 24, Timothy is a highly accomplished violinist, winning awards during his undergraduate studies at Yale University and also performing with the Boston Philharmonic. For those of you in music at all, know that's no small feat. He continued his studies in conducting at the New England Conservatory. He now holds a position as conducting fellow with a very respectable orchestra. Yet, not even 6 months into this post as conducting fellow, at 24, mind you, He is already wanting to find a greener pasture. His story is striking, at least for me. Here's one of the most disciplined, accomplished, yet oddly humble 20-somethings I've personally met. Landing his first real job, as we might say, he is ready to bail and try something else. For another example, take a team of teachers that I've attempted to lead. For years, I had a team of anywhere from 5 to 10 men, all in their 20s, who wanted to pursue teaching in the church in various forms, preaching, Sunday school, Bible studies, and the like. These young men have various skills. I am from Mississippi, so pardon my vowels. Skills and experience. They committed themselves to meet weekly, have their work evaluated by their peers, and of course, evaluate the work of their peers. Knowing that young men are drawn to teaching in the church for various reasons, some much more self-serving than others, I developed a process of assimilation that would move them quickly, that would quickly sort out who has the legs to run the race that our team was running. The process goes like this. A young man would be interested in joining the team. He would need to attend weekly meetings for 3 months in observation mode only. That is, he would arrive, listen to the constructive criticisms going on among the team for 3 months before he could provide his own critique of a teacher. At the 3-month mark, the teacher in training would submit an outline and give a lesson in full to the team. The team would then provide immediate feedback to the teacher. Assuming the teacher handled the criticism well, which is not always the case, I might add, he would be put on rotation for the team and then be part of it. Suffice it to say, the level of commitment was not an issue for this team. Yet realizing that each teacher would only teach once a month, some perhaps less than that, I knew that these young men needed more experience and more opportunities to teach if they were to improve significantly. So I requested, and sometimes begged, for teachers to join up with the children's ministry and find opportunities to teach children during the weeks that they were not teaching for us. I never made a rule or a requirement for the teachers, as I thought enough requirements were built into our system already. I, however, knew that these young men, if they could master the art of teaching children the Bible, then everything else, their peers and those older than them, would be mere child's play. Within our own meetings, each teacher grew in his skills in interpretation and application and communication. Though none took my word, none took my suggestion to join up with the children's ministry. Thus, none grew as significantly or as quickly as they could have. These two examples demonstrate the accuracy of the Gallup poll. Millennials want purpose, development, and coaching. Commitment to some degree is there, yet at the same time, something is missing for them to flourish in their work, be it inside or outside the church. When something does not feel right, or one is left feeling unsatisfied, then two reasonable choices from a millennial point of view are go to a different place of work, or simply don't do any additional work. Do only what's required. Excuses or how one feels about their work or workplace won't find a sympathetic ear from Ruth. Understanding how marginalized she was, and somehow she was trying to provide for her distraught and distressed mother-in-law, Ruth gets about the business of work. Another element worth noting is how Ruth goes about finding the field in which to work. The narrator tells us she happened upon it. A nice turn of phrase. Before she came to this field, however, she knew she needed to find favor of the owner. Yet why would Ruth need to find favor? Why would she need to make this caveat? After all, Leviticus 19, 9 through 10 states, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap the field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after the harvest, and you shall not strip the vineyard bare. Neither shall you gather fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for, now quote, poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Now, perhaps Ruth, being a Moabite, she didn't know this. My question is, why didn't Naomi tell her? Ruth, of course, asked for Naomi's permission to go and work the field. Noting that she will need to find favor to be able to work it. This is the perfect context for Naomi to step in and give the stipulations from Leviticus. I suggest the reason we never hear Naomi give such a directive is because things were not altogether well in Bethlehem. For example, Naomi will later demand Ruth to go and clean to the female servants of Boaz, else in another field Ruth will be assaulted. That is to say, even if there was a stipulation of what should occur in the field of Judah, it does not mean that the gleaning rights were being upheld. In fact, the context of Ruth 2 points in the opposite direction. To use language from Judges, the landowners in Judah were doing what was right in their own eyes. Of course, that could naturally connect to the gleaning rights, because not harvesting the edge of a field and leaving gleanings on the ground had an economic cost to it. Thus, someone more concerned with the bottom line would forego such a practice for financial gain. Such an observation, sadly, we should add, shows how exceptional Boaz is in his care of the land and the needy. But what does this show of Ruth and her work? I suggest there is something to be learned here that has significant implications for moderns, and in particular, if I may belabor the point, millennials especially. Millennials have rightly and wrongly been labeled entitled. Sociologists and statisticians struggle to bring consistent data to the table on this score. Nevertheless, attitudes such as millennials feel they deserve certain things and feel superior to others have a steady trend in the research. Now, of course, I should clarify for all my students here, I've never met a millennial with those attitudes at all, ever, at Southwestern. As has been pointed out recently in the research, there is an upside to this so-called entitlement complex. Things such as drive towards achievement or creativity appear to be some of the positive results. The downsides of the attitudes are as follows, and I quote, demand higher pay, break rules, want special privileges, and act selfishly. In our narrative, Ruth could have demanded any landowner in Judah take up and heed the words of Leviticus 19. Or, at the very least, Naomi could have commanded Ruth to call the landowners on the carpet. After all, as you recall, in chapter 3 of Ruth, Naomi gives very specific details of what Ruth should do. So she has no problem commanding Ruth to do or say something. To be clear, though, for Ruth, this is no call for entitlement. There is only a disciplined hand at work. In a very literal and positive way, Ruth and Naomi, as poor, needy widows, were entitled. They were entitled to glean the fields in Judah. Yet Ruth not once shows such an entitlement at any landowner. Such a characterization should help us curb our appetite for doing what we feel we deserve. Instead, we should consider about the business of work and let our work do the talking. When it comes to the book of Ruth, we can't escape the difficulty and uncertainty that Ruth herself faced. Being in Judah, the land of her mother-in-law, mind you, not her own land, she did not waver, either in action or deed. Instead, she asked to work, knowing that physical effort would be necessary for her and her widowed mother-in-law to flourish in the land. Now, picking back up in chapter 2, our narrator tells us that Ruth happens upon the field of Boaz, the very Boaz that's related to Elimelech. Boaz soon inquires of the young woman who is working in the field. Boaz is informed in this order. Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth has returned with Naomi from Moab. She has requested to work, and interestingly, she has been working in the field for a while with little break. That is to say, the narrative will not let us forget that Ruth is a foreigner, and she hardly knows anyone in Judah, certainly not the owner of the field, yet she is working. There's no appeal to tragedy in Moab. There's no appeal to widowhood, options that would have been reasonable. No, she works. It is her work that first draws the attention of Boaz. After hearing about Ruth, Boaz now speaks directly to her. His speech is kind and direct. He calls her Betty. He calls her my daughter. The same as Naomi calls her in chapter 1. He directs her to stay in the field and to cling to his ne'arot, his female servants. What is more, he tells Ruth that he commanded his ne'arim, our Hebrew students should note that, his male servants not to touch her. To add even more comfort, should Ruth need water, his male servants will draw it. Ruth, shocked by Boaz's words, falls to the ground and asks why she has found favor in his eyes. After all, she is a foreigner. This speech continues to press the fact that Ruth is not an Israelite. The narrative has raised our anticipation for what Boaz might say. Boaz begins his answer in no uncertain terms. It is what Ruth did for Naomi that kept Boaz's interest, specifically how she forsook her own mother and father, her own land, and went to the land of Naomi. Boaz blesses her, specifically in economic idiom. He says, "May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel." Here, even Ruth's care for Naomi is said to be work. Boaz follows up his conversation with Ruth by directing her to come and eat. After that, she arises to glean, noting that Boaz gives specific instructions to his male servants. As before, Ruth gleans till evening. Her work totaled ke'ephah se'orot, about an ephah of barley. Now, it's important to note what this means here. Food rations for the needy in the ancient Near East would be about 1 liter. Ruth gets somewhere between 10 and 20 liters. This should take care of Ruth and Naomi both for a week. Such a notation of quantity speaks positively of Boaz's generosity as well as Ruth's labor. Following this, Ruth brings her gleanings back to her mother-in-law. Naturally, Naomi asks, "Where did you glean? Where did you work?" A noticeable emphasis is put on location. The narrative is leading us along to watch Naomi and Ruth discover how Boaz will relate to Naomi's rekam, her emptiness. Ruth then tells Naomi that it was Boaz under whose guidance and kindness she worked. Naomi explains that Boaz is a relative and that he is one who can redeem them. This realization lifts up the anticipation of the narrative, for indeed both women understand their lives may be changed. Indeed, hope is in the air. The reader should flip quickly to the next page to see what will happen, what will unfold. But let us not miss, however, that it is Ruth's work that has brought Boaz into the conversation. Without her efforts, the women will most likely have no contact with this Redeemer. But what of Boaz? It is his crops, his land, his servants that give space for Ruth to glean, space that she happens upon. In characterization of Boaz, particularly relating to work, what do we see? What is the question? How may we answer this? First, in Ruth 2, 8 through 9, he directs Ruth to stay in the field and work, cling to his female servants. Second, he commands his male servants that they should not nog egg, that they should not touch her, touch Ruth specifically. We get a pretty clear picture of how other fields were run when Naomi, who is from Judah, warns Ruth to stay close to Boaz's servants, lest she go into another field and be pagah, be assaulted by them. It is interesting to consider the topics of Boaz and work in our modern workplace. There are many that would view the contents of the biblical text in general as arcane, backwards, misplaced, patriarchal ideology from yesteryear, though I suspect and hope that none here view it that way. Nevertheless, such a thought is complemented with the idea that our society has progressed significantly and we've broken the chains of this dinosaurian culture. Yet, the characterization of Boaz in Ruth 2 has much to say to our so-called sophisticated society of the 21st century. Boaz, the owner of the field, has given protection to arguably the most marginalized in the society, a foreign widow. What draws his attention to her first, and this is key, first is her work. Then he discovers her character that she displayed toward Naomi. Suffice it to say, Boaz's workplace was one that made space and had rules for protecting women. Yet in our impressively progressive society, there has been scandal upon scandal of sexual misconduct and abuse, almost exclusively actions done by men in power to women in the workplace. Now, before I state any contemporary name that you might hold dear, or before we go round and round about the difference between allegations and legal convictions, let me be quite clear on this one. The problem in our society is not new. Take the David and Bathsheba narrative as a classic example. While there is certainly inappropriate sexual relations in the narrative, I suggest quite strongly, if I may, that the narrator is not teaching merely don't have sex out of wedlock. Rather, David's tale is one of power, the thirst and exploits of it. Bathsheba, Uriah, and others are simply objects for David's quest for power. That, I suggest, connects to what our culture at large is awakening to. The power and exploits of men in particular, objectifying others, specifically women, to gain and maintain some very ill-conceived sense of dominance. The kindness and protection that Boaz gives to the most marginalized should be heard afresh by followers of Jesus. First, those who have stewardship and some form of leadership within their church should look closely and carefully at how people can and do exercise power and influence. Second, those who teach congregations, however big or small, should explain to businessmen and women in some detail and preferably with some regularity how Boaz in this narrative opens up ideas for mature and caring regulations in their organizations. Rather than simply having a knee-jerk reaction to the latest news headline, preachers and teachers within the church should build a positive case for how the Bible speaks of ethics, character, and work in ways that connect to the modern workplace. Chapters 3 and 4 of Ruth move on to the locations of the threshing floor and city gate, respectively. While there are significant speeches and actions in those chapters, especially as the narrative concludes with David, the theme of work does not appear in any significant way. Therefore, I will not discuss them in any detail. I will, however, note Boaz's description of Ruth in chapter 3 as a jumping-off point for further consideration of theology of work. While at the threshing floor, Boaz commits to do what Ruth has asked of him. He clarifies the reason he will do so is because of Ruth's character. Specifically, Ruth is an Eshet Chayo, a competent woman. Curiously, this phrase rarely appears in the Bible, but just so happens to appear as the leading descriptor of what has been termed in our day a Proverbs 31 woman. This observation becomes more interesting in the Hebrew Bible in contrast to the English Bible. The contrast concerns canonical placement or ordering of the books of the Bible. The English Bible reflects the ordering of the Greek Old Testament. In this case, Ruth follows the book of Judges. Of course, this makes complete sense. The book of Ruth opens up in the time of Judges, so therefore put it after the book of Judges. In one tradition of the Hebrew Bible, however, Ruth follows the book of Proverbs. This placement seems to be thematic, specifically drawing attention to the Eshet Chayo, the competent woman. Turn to Proverbs 31 to discover exactly what this competent woman is about would seem to be interesting, if not also instructive. This well-known acrostic poem details the character and actions of a woman, by all accounts, who is quite difficult to find. What cannot be missed in this poem is the stress of the woman's work. Specifically, she does so with willing hands, verse 13. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household, verse 15. She plants a vineyard, verse 16. She puts her hand to the spindle, verse 19. She makes linen, verse 22. And my personal favorite and poetic idiom here, she does not eat the bread of idleness, verse 27. The poem concludes with her work, that is, specifically her work, praising her at the gate. As the able interpreter Michael Fox puts it, the picture of Eshet Chayo, a competent woman, is realistic insofar as it describes a real type of woman, albeit impressive and rare, but perhaps not all that rare. We would slight human women to assume otherwise. He goes on to say, and I quote, this is a woman, but not a particular woman. She is an ideal. She is a paragon of feminine virtues, practical and ethical, end quote. Many interpreters of the book of Ruth are quick to note the canonical placement and thematic connections to Proverbs 31. What's more, Trimper Longman's description of the woman in Proverbs 31 is correct, just as it is unexceptional. He writes, the competent woman is the epitome of hard work. She eschews laziness, which is a wisdom principle that has been taught throughout the book of Proverbs. Now, for me, it is quite irritating to read Old Testament theologies that often devote an entire chapter to Ruth that say virtually nothing of the topic of work, be it Ruth's actions or how Boaz manages his land and workers. In contrast, the Old Testament theologies put their attention primarily on the conclusion of the book, on David. To be sure, I agree with the attention given to the book's conclusion, however, not to the exclusion of the first two chapters. Old Testament theology as a discipline is uniquely set up to give space to various themes present in any biblical book. Thus, the book of Ruth, the theological themes within it, can live. An apologetic for David, perhaps. Theological theme of work. Non-Israelites having faith in Yahweh, to name but a few. But the book need not be reduced to one theme only. Of course, reviewing various Old Testament theologies and discovering they say virtually nothing about the topic of work and Ruth can produce an unsettling feeling for one who is giving a talk, as I am right now, on Ruth and work. I trust I've been able to demonstrate in some small way that a theology of work, which would include here work ethics, setting aside excuses for why work is difficult or uncomfortable, and work environment which should care for the vulnerable as part of the organizational structure, these themes are indeed present in the book of Ruth. My hope is those tasked with teaching and leading local congregations will begin to study the richness of the theology of work and communicate it often to men and women who spend a majority of their time outside of the church doing work. Thank you very much.